A father adopts a black baby, hoping to give him a better life. But years later, he gets a shocking surprise that threatens to tear everything apart. What happens when a stranger shows up claiming to be Elijah's real family? Can a father truly know what's best for his son? Or will a hidden past change everything? This story will challenge everything you think you know about love, family, and identity. Don't miss this powerful journey of connection, conflict, and unexpected revelations. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted warm squares on George Wilkins's kitchen table as he sat alone, his coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. The tick-tock of the wall clock echoed through the empty house, each second a reminder of his solitude. Another quiet morning, he whispered to himself, running a finger along the rim of his coffee mug. 2 years had passed since Susan's death, but the silence still felt strange. Their home, once filled with laughter and life, now held only memories. His gaze drifted to the family photos on the wall. His grown children smiled back at him from their frames, happy in their distant lives in Seattle and Boston. Monthly phone calls and occasional visits weren't enough to fill the void in his daily life. That afternoon, George settled into his favorite armchair, flicking on the TV news for company. The usual headlines scrolled by until a segment caught his attention. A reporter stood outside a local children's home, speaking about the growing need for adoptive parents. "These children just want a chance at having a loving family," the reporter said, her voice gentle but urgent. "Many will spend years in the system without finding a permanent home." George sat up straighter, something stirring in his heart. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly as memories of his teaching days flooded back. The joy of helping young minds grow. The satisfaction of making a difference. The next day, his hands shook as he dialed the number for Hope Valley Adoption Agency. A warm voice answered, introducing herself as Maggie, a social worker. "I'm interested in adopting," George said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "I'm a retired teacher, and I have love to give." Maggie guided him through the initial conversation with patience and understanding. When she mentioned a baby boy named Elijah who needed a home, George felt an unexpected flutter in his chest. "He's a beautiful black infant," Maggie explained carefully. "He's been with us since birth." George paused, considering the responsibility before him. "Tell me more about him," he said softly, already feeling a connection he couldn't explain. The conversation continued, and with each detail about Elijah, George's certainty grew. This was meant to be. This was his chance to make a difference, not just in a child's life, but in his own. Standing outside the adoption agency weeks later, George held Elijah for the first time. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his index finger, and tears welled in George's eyes. In that moment, the emptiness that had haunted his house seemed to fade away, replaced by something new and wonderful: hope. The soft glow of the nightlight cast gentle shadows across Elijah's nursery as George rocked his son to sleep. The walls, painted in soothing mint green, had transformed what was once a spare room into a haven of love. Elijah's tiny breaths grew steady against George's chest, his dark curls tickling George's chin. "That's my boy," George whispered, carefully placing Elijah in his crib. At 6 months old, Elijah had already brought more joy into George's life than he thought possible. The days fell into a rhythm: bottle feedings, diaper changes, and precious moments of play. George learned to interpret each of Elijah's cries, discovering that gentle humming could soothe even the fussiest moments. The house that had once felt too quiet now echoed with baby giggles and the soft squeak of toys. Time seemed to speed up. Before George knew it, Elijah was taking his first wobbly steps across the living room floor, his little arms outstretched for balance. His first word, "Dada," brought tears to George's eyes. But preschool changed everything. Sitting across from Mrs. Blake during the parent-teacher conference, George felt his world shift. "Mr. Wilkins," Mrs. Blake began, her voice gentle but concerned, "I need to discuss something with you. Some children have been unkind to Elijah. They've made comments about his skin color, calling him dark and strange. George's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands, pale against the dark wood of the conference table. The weight of what Mrs. Blake was saying pressed against his chest. I didn't expect this. Not so soon, he managed to say. That evening, George sat on his worn leather couch, his eyes fixed on the family photos. There was Elijah on his first birthday, cake smeared across his beautiful brown face. Another showed them at the park, both laughing as autumn leaves fell around them. The images blurred as tears filled George's eyes. He felt unprepared, guilty even. How could he protect his son from something so cruel, so deeply rooted? The responsibility felt overwhelming, but as he heard Elijah's soft breathing through the baby monitor, his resolve strengthened. He had to find a way. His son deserved nothing less. George sat at his kitchen table early the next morning, his coffee growing cold as he dialed Maggie's number. His fingers drummed nervously on the wooden surface while he waited. "Maggie, it's George Wilkins," he said, his voice tight with worry. "I need some advice about Elijah." As he explained the situation at preschool, Maggie listened patiently. "There's a wonderful cultural camp for children of color," she suggested warmly. "It could help Elijah connect with his heritage and meet other kids like him." George nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "That sounds good, but—" he hesitated. "I don't know much about his culture myself." "That's okay, George. Start with some reading. I can recommend some books." Over the next few days, George immersed himself in books and articles about racial issues. Each evening, after tucking Elijah into bed, he'd stay up late reading, taking notes, trying to understand. The following week, George pulled into the camp's parking lot, his stomach in knots. Colorful banners welcomed them, and children's laughter filled the air. Elijah bounced excitedly in his car seat. As they walked in, George noticed he was the only white parent there. He smiled at the other parents, but some barely nodded back. During the orientation, a father named Jamal approached him. "So you adopted him?" Jamal asked, his tone sharp. "Yes, I did," George replied. "Why would you adopt a black child if you don't understand our struggles?" Jamal's words cut through the air like a knife. George felt his face grow hot. I love him," he stammered. "I'm trying to learn." Elijah tugged at his hand. "Daddy, why is that man mad? Does he not like me?" The drive home was quiet. That evening, George sat with Elijah on their favorite spot on the couch. "Dad?" Elijah's small voice broke the silence. "Do those people not like me because I'm black?" George pulled his son close. "No, buddy. They just don't understand our family yet. But I will always be here for you, no matter what." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as George stirred his coffee, his mind replaying yesterday's uncomfortable encounter at the camp. Elijah was still asleep upstairs, giving George time to think. He opened his laptop and found a notice about a town hall meeting that evening, discussing race relations in their community. His heart beat faster as he read the details. Maybe this was a chance to learn more, to be better for Elijah. That evening, George sat in the back row of the crowded community center. The room buzzed with energy as different speakers took the podium. His notebook remained blank as he absorbed every word. Then Angela Simmons stepped up to speak. Her voice carried strength and wisdom as she described the challenges black children face in predominantly white communities. "These children need strong support systems," she said, her words striking a chord in George's heart. "They need people who understand their struggles and celebrate their identity." After the meeting ended, George waited nervously to speak with Angela. His hands were slightly shaky as he approached her. "Ms. Simmons," he said softly. "I'm George Wilkins. I adopted my son, Elijah. He's black, and I'm struggling to give him what he needs." Angela's expression softened. "That takes courage to admit, Mr. Wilkins." "I want to do better for him," George continued, "but sometimes I feel lost." "Let's meet for coffee next week," Angela suggested warmly. "I can help connect you with other families and share some resources." Your son needs a community that reflects who he is. Back home, George sat at his kitchen table, carefully writing down everything he remembered from the meeting. His earlier uncertainty was replaced with something new: hope. He might not have all the answers, but he wasn't alone anymore. He had taken the first step toward building a better future for Elijah. George watched as Elijah trudged through the front door, his small shoulders slumped, his backpack dragged behind him, scraping against the floor, so different from his usual bouncy entrance. "Hey, buddy," George said gently. "How was school today?" Elijah shrugged, avoiding his father's eyes. "Fine. Are you sure? We could talk about it if something's bothering you." "Everything's okay, Dad." Elijah's voice was quiet as he headed upstairs to his room. George's heart ached as he watched his son disappear. The past few months had brought subtle changes in Elijah: fewer smiles, less chatter at dinner, and a growing distance that George couldn't seem to bridge. At the parent-teacher conference the following week, Mrs. Blake's concerned expression made George's stomach twist before she even spoke. "Mr. Wilkins," she began, shuffling some papers on her desk. "I'm worried about Elijah. He used to be one of our most engaged students, always raising his hand, always excited to participate. But lately," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "he's become very withdrawn. During group activities, he keeps to himself. He barely speaks up in class anymore." George's throat tightened. "Has something specific happened?" "Nothing obvious," Mrs. Blake replied. "But it's like he's built invisible walls around himself." That evening, George sat alone in the living room, the TV off, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of floorboards from Elijah's room above. He stared at his hands, feeling the weight of doubt pressing down on him. Maybe Elijah needed someone else, someone who truly understood what it meant to grow up Black in America, someone who could guide him through experiences George would never fully comprehend. The thought of not being enough for his son made his chest ache. He loved Elijah with all his heart, but love alone couldn't bridge every gap. George buried his face in his hands, wrestling with the possibility that his best intentions might not be what Elijah needed most. The community center buzzed with quiet conversation as George stepped inside. Warm sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a circle of chairs where parents sat sharing their stories. Angela's face lit up when she saw him. "George, I'm so glad you made it," she said, gesturing to an empty chair. As George settled in, he listened intently to a mother describing her daughter's struggle to fit in at school. Another parent spoke about teaching his son to be proud of his heritage while dealing with prejudice. Their words resonated deeply with George's own concerns about Elijah. "Sometimes my son comes home crying because kids won't play with him," one father shared, his voice thick with emotion. "But we've found that having strong Black role models in his life has helped him build confidence." After the meeting, Angela and George sat at a small table near the window. George's coffee grew cold as he described Elijah's withdrawal at school. "It's not uncommon," Angela said softly. "Children need to see themselves reflected in the people around them. They need mentors who understand their experiences firsthand." "But how do I find these mentors?" George asked, worry creasing his forehead. Angela reached across the table and patted his hand. "There are plenty of people in our community who would love to be there for Elijah. Teachers, coaches, professionals. But remember, this isn't about replacing you. It's about adding more layers of support to help him grow." On the drive home, George's mind whirled with everything he'd learned. The stories from other parents echoed in his thoughts. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft oranges and pinks. The task ahead felt enormous. Building a community of support for Elijah would take time and effort. But for the first time in weeks, he felt less alone in this journey. Marcus Thompson stood tall in his office at the community center, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled at Elijah. The walls behind him were covered with colorful artwork and inspirational quotes. "So, Elijah, what do you like to do for fun?" Marcus asked, his deep voice warm and gentle. George sat quietly in the corner, watching as his usually reserved son began to open up. Elijah's eyes sparkled as he talked about his favorite superhero movies and his love for drawing. "I draw lots of things," Elijah said, sitting up straighter. but sometimes kids at school make fun of my pictures. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. You know, I used to love drawing too. Still do, actually. Would you like to see some of my work? Elijah nodded eagerly, and Marcus pulled out a sketchbook filled with vibrant illustrations. As they flipped through the pages together, Marcus shared stories about each drawing, making Elijah laugh. Over the next few weeks, Elijah spent time at Marcus's community center after school. The space buzzed with energy as children worked on homework, created art, and played games together. George noticed how Elijah's shoulders relaxed when he was there, how his smile came more easily. "Dad, guess what?" Elijah burst out one afternoon. "Marcus showed us how to make comic books. And Jamie, he's my new friend. He likes the same superheroes as me." George watched as his son found his place among the other children, sharing stories and laughter. Marcus worked with them all, offering guidance and encouragement, teaching them about their heritage through stories and activities. "Your son is flourishing here," Marcus told George one day. "Sometimes all it takes is seeing yourself reflected in others to start believing in yourself." That evening, Elijah bounded through their front door, clutching a drawing he'd made at the center. His face glowed with excitement as he showed it to George, a colorful portrait of himself surrounded by his new friends. "Look, Dad, Marcus helped me make it perfect." The phone rang on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. George was helping Elijah with his homework when Mrs. Blake's name flashed on the screen. "Mr. Wilkins, I have wonderful news." Mrs. Blake's voice was bright. Elijah won first place for his project on racial injustice. His presentation was incredibly moving. George's chest swelled with pride. "That's amazing. I knew he worked hard on it." But Mrs. Blake's tone shifted slightly. "There's something else. Elijah's biological aunt, Andrea, contacted the school. She'd like to meet with you." George's hand tightened around the phone. His heart raced as Mrs. Blake shared the details. Later that week, George and Elijah walked into the Sweet Bean coffee shop. Andrea was already there, sitting straight-backed at a corner table. She stood when they approached, her eyes fixed on Elijah. "Hello, Elijah," she said softly, then turned to George with a cooler gaze. "Mr. Wilkins." They settled into their seats, an awkward silence hanging between them. Andrea ordered a black coffee while George got Elijah a hot chocolate. "I need to ask," Andrea began, her fingers drumming against her cup. "Why did you, a white man, choose to adopt a black child?" George felt his face grow warm. "I adopted Elijah because he needed a home, and I needed him. It's as simple as that." "Is it?" Andrea's voice sharpened. "Do you understand what it means to raise a black child? The challenges he'll face? The cultural heritage he needs to know?" George took a deep breath. "I may not understand everything, but I'm learning. I love Elijah, and I'm committed to helping him understand and embrace his heritage." Andrea's expression softened slightly, but her doubt remained clear. He should have been with family, with people who understand his background firsthand. Elijah sat quietly, his hot chocolate untouched, eyes moving between the adults. The meeting ended with Andrea agreeing to stay in touch, though her reservations were obvious. As they walked to the car, Elijah tugged at George's sleeve. "Dad, is everything okay?" George squeezed his son's shoulder. "We're just trying to figure some things out, buddy." But even as he spoke the words, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. George sat at his desk, scrolling through Andrea's latest text messages. Each one felt like a subtle reminder that he might not be enough for Elijah. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the family photos on the wall. "Dad?" Elijah's voice broke through his thoughts. "Can we talk?" George turned to see his son standing in the doorway, looking more confident than he had in months. "Of course, buddy. What's on your mind?" Elijah sat down on the small couch in the study. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done, the community center, introducing me to Marcus. I feel like I know who I am now." Before George could respond, the doorbell rang. Andrea stood on the porch, her expression determined. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, stepping into the dining room where dinner was still laid out. "I've been thinking about something." George offered her a seat, his stomach tightening. "What's on your mind?" "I need to know." Andrea leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Have you ever really understood our struggle? Were you ever involved in the civil rights movement?" George's hands trembled slightly as memories flooded back. "I was there," he said quietly. "I grew up in Montgomery, saw the segregated water fountains, the separate entrances. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." His voice grew stronger. "I marched, I protested. I saw brave people beaten for wanting basic human rights. That's why I became a teacher, to help create change." Andrea's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. You were there?" "I was," George nodded, emotion thick in his voice. "And those experiences shaped who I am. They're part of why I knew I could love Elijah and help him navigate this world." Tears welled in Andrea's eyes. "I'm sorry, George. I was wrong about you. I see now. You're not just raising Elijah. You're fighting for him. You always have been." George watched Elijah push his meatloaf around his plate, barely taking a bite. The kitchen felt heavy with unspoken words. The usual warmth of their dinner conversations had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence. "How was school today?" George asked, trying to catch his son's eye. "Fine," Elijah mumbled, still focused on his plate. George's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Excuse me for a minute, buddy." In the living room, Marcus's voice was filled with concern. "George, I wanted to talk to you about Elijah. He's been spending more time with the kids here, which is great, but something seems off." "I've noticed it too," George said quietly, glancing back at the kitchen. "Some of the kids mentioned that Elijah's been talking about not fitting in. He feels caught between two worlds. Too white for his black friends, too black for his white classmates." George's heart sank. "What do you suggest?" "He needs someone to talk to about this," Marcus explained. "One-on-one conversations about identity, history, and self-acceptance. Help him understand that he doesn't have to choose between worlds." That evening, George found Elijah in his room, sitting on his bed with a book he wasn't really reading. "Can we talk?" George asked softly, sitting beside him. Elijah shrugged but put his book down. "Something's been bothering you," George said. "I'm here to listen." Elijah's shoulders tensed. After a long pause, he whispered, "I don't fit in anywhere, Dad. At school, I'm different from everyone else. At the community center," his voice cracked, "I'm not black enough. I don't know where I belong." George's heart ached as he watched his son struggle with words that no child should have to say. The museum's marble halls echoed with their footsteps as George and Elijah walked through the Civil Rights exhibition. Black and white photographs lined the walls, showing faces full of determination and hope. George watched as Elijah stopped at each display, his eyes taking in every detail. "This was taken during the Montgomery bus boycott," George explained softly, pointing to a photograph. Elijah nodded, moving closer to study the image. They continued through the exhibits, past displays of lunch counter sit-ins and freedom rides. George's heart tightened when they reached the section about school integration. He remembered those days all too well. Standing before a large portrait of Martin Luther King Jr., Elijah's small hand found George's. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why does it always seem like it's so hard for people like me?" George squeezed his son's hand gently. "That's a big question, buddy." He knelt down beside Elijah, meeting his eyes. "You know, when I was young, I saw a lot of unfair things happening. I couldn't just stand by and watch." "What did you do?" Elijah asked, his attention fully focused on George. "I joined protests and marches. I walked alongside people who believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." George's voice grew thick with emotion. "I remember one march in particular. It was hot and we'd been walking for hours. But nobody gave up because we knew what we were fighting for was right." Elijah's eyes widened. "You really did that?" "I did. And people are still fighting today in different ways. Each generation faces its own challenges, but we keep moving forward, trying to make things better." For the first time in weeks, George saw a spark of understanding in Elijah's eyes. His son looked back at Dr. King's portrait, then at George, with newfound interest. As they moved through the rest of the exhibition, Elijah stayed close to George, asking questions about the photographs and the stories behind them. The silence between them had finally broken, replaced by genuine curiosity and connection. The kitchen was warm with afternoon sunlight as George helped Elijah with his school project. Colored markers and paper were scattered across the table, and Elijah was explaining his ideas with more enthusiasm than he'd shown in weeks. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. George opened it to find Andrea standing there, her expression serious. "George, can we talk?" He invited her in, and Elijah gave his aunt a small wave before returning to his project. "I've been hearing things," Andrea began, her voice softer than usual. She settled into a kitchen chair, glancing at Elijah. "Some parents mentioned that Elijah's been keeping to himself at school. More than usual." George nodded slowly, feeling the familiar weight of worry settle in his chest. "I know I wasn't fair to you before," Andrea continued, wringing her hands. "I judged you without really knowing you or understanding how much you care for Elijah." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I want to help." George leaned forward, surprised by the change in her tone. "What did you have in mind?" "Elijah has cousins, family members who could show him what it's like to be around people who share his background." Andrea's eyes were earnest. "Maybe if he spent some time with them, it would help him feel more connected to who he is." George watched Elijah coloring at the table, his small face focused on his work. The idea made sense, but it also made his heart ache. "You think that would help?" "I do," Andrea said gently. "He needs to see himself reflected in the people around him. My kids, his cousins, they could be like brothers and sisters to him." Standing at the door after Andrea left, George felt torn. The sound of Elijah humming to himself drifted from the kitchen as George stared out into the evening, wondering what choice would be best for his son. George sat at the kitchen counter, his coffee growing cold as he waited for Elijah to speak. The boy had been shifting nervously in his chair for several minutes, clearly wrestling with something on his mind. "Dad," Elijah finally said, his voice quiet but determined, "I want to visit Aunt Andrea and my cousins." George set down his mug, giving Elijah his full attention. "How do you feel about that?" "Scared, kind of." Elijah's fingers traced patterns on the countertop. "Like I'm being pulled both ways. Is that wrong?" George's heart ached with understanding. "No, son, it's not wrong at all." He reached across and placed his hand over Elijah's fidgeting fingers. "You don't have to pick sides. Both parts of your life matter, who you were born to be and who we are together." Tears welled up in Elijah's eyes. "You won't be mad if I go?" "Never," George said firmly. "I'll support whatever you decide. This is part of your journey." That weekend, George helped Elijah pack an overnight bag for Andrea's house. As he watched his son climb into Andrea's car, his heart felt both heavy and hopeful. When Elijah returned Sunday evening, he was unusually quiet. They sat together on the living room couch, and George waited patiently for Elijah to share. "My cousins taught me some cool games," Elijah said softly, "and Aunt Andrea told stories about my mom." He paused, looking up at George. "But you know what, Dad? Even though it was nice, I missed home. I missed you." "What do you mean?" George asked gently. "I liked being there, but—" Elijah's words came slowly, thoughtfully. "This is where I belong. With you. Is that okay?" George pulled Elijah into a tight hug, feeling the boy relax against him. "That's more than okay, son. That's perfect." The community center buzzed with energy as people filed in for the diversity celebration. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the air was filled with the sound of cheerful conversation. George adjusted his tie nervously while Elijah beamed beside him, wearing his favorite blue button-down shirt. "You ready, Dad?" Elijah asked, giving George's hand a squeeze. George nodded, his heart full of pride as he watched his son confidently greet familiar faces in the crowd. These past weeks had shown him a new side of Elijah, a boy who now stood tall when challenged at school. who embraced both sides of his identity with grace. When it was time for George to speak, he walked to the podium with Elijah by his side. Looking out at the sea of faces, black, white, and every shade between, George cleared his throat and began. "Love doesn't see color," he started, "but it does recognize truth. And the truth is, raising my son Elijah has taught me more about love, strength, and understanding than I ever thought possible." As George shared their story, the challenges, the doubts, the triumphs, Elijah stood straighter beside him. His eyes shone with pride as his father described their journey together, how they'd learned to navigate the complexities of race and family with help from their community. "Being Elijah's father isn't just about providing a home," George continued, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about understanding his world, supporting his identity, and standing beside him as he grows into the remarkable young man he's becoming." The audience listened intently, many nodding in understanding. Elijah watched as his father spoke about their experiences with Andrea, Marcus, and the community center. He saw how their story touched others in the room, bringing tears to some eyes and smiles to many faces. When the applause died down, father and son walked home together through the quiet evening streets. Their footsteps fell in sync, hands clasped together. "You were right, Dad," Elijah said softly. "I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of us." George squeezed his son's hand, his heart overflowing with love and pride. They had made it through the hardest parts together, and their bond was stronger than ever. The afternoon sun warmed their faces as George and Elijah walked through Peterson Park. The cherry trees were in full bloom, their pink petals drifting lazily in the spring breeze. "So then Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech," Elijah explained, gesturing enthusiastically. "But did you know that wasn't even the speech he planned to give? He changed it right there on the spot." George smiled, watching his son's eyes light up with excitement. "Is that going to be part of your presentation?" "Yeah, and I'm going to talk about Rosa Parks, too." Elijah pulled out some note cards from his pocket. "I've been practicing a lot." Later that evening, they sat in the living room as Elijah set up his presentation materials on the coffee table. He'd created a timeline with photographs and important dates, each carefully labeled in his neat handwriting. "The civil rights movement wasn't just about one person," Elijah explained, pointing to different images. "It was about everyone coming together. Like how Marcus taught me, change happens when people stand up for what's right." George watched in amazement as Elijah confidently walked him through each section. This wasn't the same uncertain boy who'd once struggled with his identity. Now Elijah spoke with pride about both his heritage and his family. "What do you think, Dad?" Elijah asked, finishing his presentation. "I think it's wonderful," George replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But what makes me even prouder is seeing how much you've grown." Elijah gathered his papers, then looked up hopefully. "Dad, could I maybe invite Tommy and Marcus Jr. over when I'm done with the actual presentation at school? We could celebrate together?" "Of course we can," George answered warmly, watching as Elijah's face broke into a wide smile. They moved to the kitchen for dinner, the evening light casting long shadows through the windows. As George served the pasta, he felt a deep sense of contentment. They had found their way through the difficult times together and were stronger for it. The phone rang early Monday morning as George was preparing breakfast. It was Mrs. McAllister, the school principal. Her voice carried an unmistakable note of enthusiasm. "Mr. Wilkins, I have wonderful news about Elijah," she said. "His civil rights project has been selected for our annual Excellence in Academic Achievement Award. We'd love for both of you to attend the ceremony this Friday." George's hand trembled slightly as he held the phone. That's incredible news." After hanging up, he turned to find Elijah coming down the stairs, backpack slung over his shoulder. "Elijah, come here for a minute. I just got a call from Mrs. McAllister." "Is everything okay?" Elijah asked, his forehead creasing with concern. "More than okay, you've won an award for your project." George watched as surprise flickered across his son's face. Elijah shrugged, trying to play it cool. "It's just a small project, Dad." But his eyes sparkled with pride, giving away his true feelings. At the ceremony that Friday, the school auditorium buzzed with excitement. George sat in the front row watching as Elijah walked confidently to the stage when his name was called. His son stood tall at the podium, his voice clear and strong. "I want to thank my dad," Elijah said, looking directly at George. "He encouraged me to learn about my history and culture and helped me understand who I am." The audience broke into applause, and George felt tears welling up in his eyes. As Elijah made his way back to his seat, award in hand, George could see the change in him. His son carried himself differently now, shoulders back, head high, radiating a quiet confidence that came from truly knowing and accepting himself. Walking out of the auditorium afterward, they held hands. Elijah's smile was bright enough to light up the whole hallway. "Thanks again, Dad," he said softly. George simply smiled back, his heart full of pride and love for his son. The phone rang on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. George recognized Andrea's number on the caller ID. "George, I wanted to talk to you about something." Andrea's voice was warm. "We're organizing a family reunion this weekend, and I'd love for you and Elijah to come." George felt his stomach tighten slightly. "A family reunion?" "Yes, everyone's been asking about Elijah, especially after his award at school. The whole family wants to celebrate with him." When George told Elijah about the invitation, his son's eyes lit up. "Really? Can we go, Dad? Please?" George nodded, pushing aside his own uncertainties. "Of course we can." Saturday arrived bright and sunny. The reunion was held in a local park, with tables laden with food and music playing in the background. As soon as they arrived, Elijah's cousins rushed to greet him, pulling him into their games and conversations. George stood back watching as Elijah laughed with his cousins, noting how naturally he fit in with them. Their shared mannerisms, their easy laughter. It was something George could never give him. A knot formed in his throat. Andrea appeared beside him holding 2 cups of lemonade. "He's having fun," she said, handing him a cup. "He is," George agreed quietly. "They all seem so connected." "George," Andrea touched his arm gently, "you know you have nothing to worry about, right? That boy adores you. This is just another piece of who he is. It doesn't change anything between you two." As the day drew to a close, Elijah ran up to George and wrapped his arms around him in a tight hug. "Thanks for bringing me, Dad. This was the best day ever." George hugged him back, feeling the strength of their bond. In that moment, he knew Andrea was right. Their connection was unshakable, regardless of blood or background. The coffee shop buzzed with the usual weekend crowd as George and Elijah stopped for a quick break on their drive home. While waiting in line, fragments of a heated conversation drifted over from a nearby table. "Did you hear about what happened to Marcus Johnson? Pulled over 3 times in 1 week, no reason given?" George's stomach tightened as he recognized the familiar pattern being described. Beside him, Elijah tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, what's racial profiling?" Elijah's innocent question hung in the air. George guided them to a quiet corner table, their drinks forgotten. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make unfair judgments about others based on the color of their skin," George explained gently. "They might treat them differently or suspect them of doing something wrong, even when they haven't done anything." Elijah's brow furrowed, "Like how Tommy's mom always watches me extra close when I'm in their store." George's heart ached at the recognition in his son's voice. "Yes, like that. It's wrong, and it's something that's been happening for a very long time." "But why do people treat others like that?" Elijah's eyes searched George's face for answers. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand," George said softly. "But that's why it's important for people like you and me to help change things, to show others that everyone deserves to be treated with respect." Elijah sat quietly, processing this information. His usual, cheerful expression had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more serious. Later that evening, as they pulled into their driveway, Elijah spoke up. "Dad, can we go to the community center tomorrow? I want to help with their equality program." George smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "Of course we can, buddy." The community center hummed with activity as George and Elijah helped set up tables and hang colorful banners for the fundraising event. Elijah darted between groups of volunteers, his enthusiasm infectious as he worked alongside other kids his age. "Can you help us with these boxes?" a girl about Elijah's age called out. Elijah rushed over, joining a small group sorting through donated supplies. George watched from across the room as his son chatted easily with the other children, sharing stories and laughing. The tension that had once marked Elijah's interactions with peers was gone, replaced by an easy confidence. When Marcus Thompson, the event organizer, approached Elijah with a microphone, George held his breath. "Would you like to say a few words about why you're here today?" Elijah hesitated for just a moment before nodding. He stepped up to the makeshift stage, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. "Hi everyone," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm here because I believe we can make things better when we work together. Sometimes people treat others unfairly because of how they look, but that's not right. We need to stand up for what's fair and kind." The room fell silent as Elijah continued, his words touching hearts and minds. "My dad taught me that everyone deserves respect, and we all have to do our part to make that happen." Applause erupted when he finished. George felt tears welling up in his eyes as Elijah made his way back through the crowd. Later, as they sat together on a bench outside the community center, Elijah turned to George. "Dad, I'm really proud to be your son," he said softly. George pulled him close, his heart full of pride for the remarkable young man his son had become. They walked home together, hand in hand, their footsteps in perfect sync. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as George handed Elijah the invitation. "Your teacher, Mrs. Blake, thought this might be good for us," he said softly, watching his son's expression. Elijah took the paper, his fingers tracing over the words. "A community dialogue event?" He shifted in his chair, uncertainty crossing his face. "We don't have to go if you're not comfortable," George assured him, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "No, I want to," Elijah said after a moment. "Just a little nervous, I guess." At the community center, the room buzzed with energy. People from different backgrounds mingled, sharing stories and experiences. A tall woman with kind eyes approached them, introducing herself as Angela. "You must be Elijah," she said warmly. "Mrs. Blake mentioned you'd be coming today." Elijah nodded shyly. Angela sat down with them, her presence both commanding and comforting. "You know, it's not easy being caught between two worlds," she said, "but that's what makes you special. You can be a bridge." George listened intently as Angela shared her experiences fighting for racial justice. Her words carried weight, born from years of activism and dedication. Though he felt somewhat out of his depth, he appreciated her candor and wisdom. Throughout the afternoon, they moved between discussion groups. Some conversations were challenging, pushing both father and son to examine their perspectives in new ways. Other moments were enlightening, filled with stories of triumph and resilience. "Did you know there were Black inventors who created things we use every day?" Elijah asked George excitedly, after one particularly engaging discussion. As the event drew to a close, Elijah turned to George. "Thanks for bringing me, Dad," he said earnestly. "I learned so much today." George squeezed his son's shoulder, feeling grateful for the community that had welcomed them so openly. They walked toward the exit, carrying with them new understanding and a stronger sense of purpose in their shared journey. The doorbell's chime pierced the quiet afternoon, startling both George and Elijah as they settled in from their errands. George wasn't expecting anyone, and a slight frown creased his forehead as he walked to the door. A woman stood on the porch, her hands clasped tightly together. She was in her early 30s, with features that reminded George of Elijah. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Tanya, Elijah's biological mother." George's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression calm. Behind him, he heard Elijah's sharp intake of breath. "Please come in," George managed, stepping aside to let her enter. In the living room, Tanya perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting between George and Elijah. "I know this is unexpected," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I've been through some rough times, but I've turned things around. I never stopped thinking about you, Elijah." Elijah sat close to George, his shoulder pressing against his father's arm. His face showed a mix of emotions: confusion, curiosity, and uncertainty. "I'm not here to disrupt your life," Tanya continued, wiping at her eyes. "I just wanted to know you, to be part of your life if you'll let me." George placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling, son." Elijah looked up at George, then back at Tanya. I think I'd like to get to know you," he said carefully. Then he reached for George's hand. "But Dad, you'll always be my father. Always." George smiled softly, his heart full of love as Tanya and Elijah began making plans to meet again. George paced in the living room, glancing at the clock every few minutes. Elijah had been with Tanya since morning, and though George tried to keep busy, his mind kept wandering to his son. He'd already reorganized the bookshelf twice and cleaned the kitchen 3 times. When the front door finally opened, George's heart jumped. Elijah walked in quietly, his expression thoughtful. "Hey, buddy," George said softly. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" Elijah nodded, following George to the kitchen. They sat at the table, steam rising from their mugs. "Dad," Elijah began, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "Tanya showed me her apartment. She has pictures of me as a baby." George listened carefully, noting the mix of emotions in Elijah's voice. "She told me about how hard things were for her," Elijah continued, "about why she couldn't keep me, but..." He paused, looking down at his drink. "I don't know how to feel. She's my biological mom, and I can tell she cares about me, but..." "But what, son?" "But you're my dad," Elijah said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're the one who's always been there. I feel bad because part of me wants to know Tanya better, but I don't want to hurt you." George reached across the table and squeezed Elijah's hand. "You could never hurt me by wanting to know your birth mother. Our family is strong enough for this." Elijah's eyes welled up with tears. He got up and wrapped his arms around George in a tight hug. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." George held his son close, feeling the familiar warmth of their bond. "Whatever you decide about Tanya, we'll always be family. Nothing can change that." Elijah smiled through his tears, secure in the knowledge that George's love was unconditional. George stood at the window, watching Elijah climb into Tanya's car. His heart felt heavy as they drove away. These visits had become more frequent over the past few weeks, and each time George struggled with a growing sense of uncertainty. At the community center that afternoon, George sat with Angela, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. "I feel like I'm losing him," George admitted quietly. "Every time he goes to see Tanya, I wonder if he'll come back seeing me differently." Angela leaned forward, her eyes kind but firm. "George, you've been there for that boy through everything. You taught him to walk, to read, to stand up for himself. That bond doesn't just disappear because his birth mother is in the picture." George nodded, but the worry remained etched on his face. When Elijah returned that evening, he found George sitting in the living room. The boy sat down next to him, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Dad," Elijah said softly, "I know this has been hard. Sometimes I feel pulled in 2 directions and it's confusing." He looked up at George, his eyes sincere. "But you're my dad. You're the one who's always been there. That's never gonna change." George felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I just worry sometimes." "I know," Elijah replied. "But I'll always choose to be part of your life. You're my family." Later that night, Elijah came to George's study. "Dad, I'm sorry if I made you feel like you weren't important anymore. You're the best dad anyone could ask for." George pulled Elijah into a tight hug, feeling the tension of the past weeks melt away. They held each other close, both understanding that their bond was strong enough to weather any challenge. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the dining room as George, Elijah, and Tanya sat around the table. The usual tension that had marked their early meetings was gone, replaced by a comfortable warmth. George watched as Elijah passed the mashed potatoes to Tanya, his movements relaxed and natural. "This is delicious," Tanya said, smiling at George. "Thank you for having me over." "You're always welcome here," George replied, and he meant it. Looking at her now, he saw not a threat to his relationship with Elijah, but another parent who loved his son. "Dad makes the best chicken," Elijah beamed, glancing between both his parents. "Mom, you should try his secret recipe sometime." The word "mom" no longer stung George's ears. Instead, it felt right, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. "I wanted to thank you, George," Tanya said, setting down her fork. "The way you've raised Elijah with such love and understanding, I couldn't have asked for better." George felt his eyes grow misty. "He's the greatest gift I've ever received," he said softly. "And having you in his life now, it makes our family complete." Elijah sat up straighter, his face glowing with happiness. "Are you both still coming to the community celebration next week?" "Wouldn't miss it," Tanya assured him. "We'll all be there together," George added, watching his son's face light up even more. They continued talking about the upcoming celebration, making plans to meet early and help with the setup. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and shared looks of understanding. For Elijah, seeing his two worlds merge so seamlessly filled him with a deep sense of belonging. Later, as they cleared the dishes together, George caught Tanya's eye across the kitchen counter. They shared a silent moment of recognition, two parents united in their love for their son, ready to face whatever the future held together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the front porch as George sipped his coffee, watching Elijah's animated face. His son's eyes sparkled with excitement as he described his week at the leadership camp. "Dad, you should have seen it. We learned about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., but also about modern Black leaders making changes right now," Elijah said, his hands moving expressively. "There were kids just like me there. Some adopted, some not, but we all understood each other." George nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Tell me more about what you learned." "We had these amazing discussions about our heritage, about the strength of our ancestors." Elijah's voice grew thoughtful. "It made me feel powerful, you know? Like I'm part of something bigger." Over the next few days, George noticed subtle changes in his son. Elijah walked taller, spoke more confidently. During dinner one evening, he surprised George by sharing his dreams. "I think I want to study social justice in college," Elijah announced. "Maybe become a community leader like Marcus. There's so much work still to be done." George watched as Elijah moved easily between both worlds, comfortable at family dinners with George's relatives, and equally at ease at community center events with his Black mentors. He'd found his balance, no longer struggling to choose between identities. That evening, they attended the Cultural Center's diversity celebration. George hung back, watching Elijah work the room with natural ease. His son moved confidently between groups, chatting with kids from all backgrounds, his smile genuine and relaxed. He belonged here, in this space between worlds, building bridges with his presence. "This is amazing," Elijah said, returning to George's side. "I never thought I could feel so complete." George sat across from Andrea at the sunlit cafe, watching steam rise from his coffee cup. The familiar scent of fresh pastries filled the air as they settled into their seats. Andrea's demeanor was different now. Her shoulders relaxed, her smile genuine. "How's Elijah doing?" she asked, stirring her tea. "He's thriving," George replied, his face lighting up. "The leadership camp really changed something in him. His confidence has grown so much. Just yesterday, he led a discussion group at the community center about racial identity." Andrea nodded, her eyes warm with approval. "I've noticed the change in him too. He seems more whole somehow." They fell into an easy conversation, the tension that had marked their earlier meetings notably absent. Andrea wrapped her hands around her cup and leaned forward. "I need to tell you something, George," she said softly. "I've been thinking about our past conversations, about my concerns when you first adopted Elijah." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I was wrong. I've seen how much Elijah's grown under your care and the love you have for him. It's what matters most." George felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Andrea. That means a lot." "You've done more than just love him," Andrea continued. "You've helped him embrace both sides of who he is. Not many people could do that." They discussed Elijah's progress, sharing stories and hopes for his future. When their meeting drew to a close, Andrea stood and wrapped George in a warm hug. "I'm proud of the man he's becoming," she whispered, "and you're a big part of that, George." As George headed home, he felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. The school gymnasium buzzed with excitement, packed with proud families and graduating seniors. George sat in the bleachers, his heart swelling as he watched Elijah standing at the front with his classmates. The black graduation gown made him look taller, more grown up. Tanya sat on one side of George, Andrea on the other, their blended family united in celebration. George's mind drifted to the challenging moments they'd faced, the difficult conversations about race, the tears, the uncertainty. But here was Elijah now, strong and confident, ready to take on the world. "Elijah Wilkins," the principal called. The crowd erupted in cheers as Elijah crossed the stage. George jumped to his feet, clapping until his hands hurt. Tears welled in his eyes as Elijah accepted his diploma, flashing that bright smile George loved so much. After the ceremony, George and Elijah found a quiet corner away from the bustling crowd. Elijah's eyes were misty as he turned to George. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I wouldn't be here without you. Everything you've done for me, all the support you've given me. Thank you." George pulled Elijah into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, son. You've grown into an amazing young man." They talked about Elijah's plans to attend the local college, where he'd study social justice. His passion for equality and advocacy burned bright, and George couldn't have been more proud. As the celebrations wound down, they walked arm in arm toward their car. George felt overwhelmed with love for his son, grateful for every step of their journey together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the living room windows as George sat surrounded by photo albums. His weathered fingers traced the edges of countless memories. Elijah's first steps, his proud grin at the science fair, their camping trips together. Each photo told a story of their journey, of the love that had grown between them despite every challenge. The house felt unusually quiet. Soon, Elijah would be living on campus, pursuing his dreams. George paused at a recent photo from graduation day, remembering how his heart had swelled with pride, seeing Elijah accept his diploma. The soft thud of footsteps drew his attention. Elijah appeared in the doorway, suitcase in hand, his face bright with excitement for the adventure ahead. "Dad, I'm ready to go," Elijah said, smiling warmly. George stood up, crossing the room in a few steps. He wrapped his arms around his son in a tight embrace, feeling the strength in Elijah's returning hug. His throat felt tight with emotion. "I love you so much, son," George managed. "I'm so proud of everything you've become." Elijah's eyes glistened. "I love you too, Dad." George helped Elijah load his bags into the car, each trip between house and driveway marking another step toward this new chapter. As Elijah slid into the driver's seat, George stood on the front porch, watching his son prepare to drive toward his future. His heart felt full knowing that their journey together had shaped them both in ways he never could have imagined. The engine started, and George watched as Elijah's car pulled away from the curb. He remained on the porch, filled with a deep sense of contentment, knowing that the love they shared would always guide them both. If you enjoyed the story of George, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.